In the last part of lesson 5, we're going to look at a Bayes rule problem. In this problem, the life insurance company issues standard and premier policies. A standard policy is sold for $1,430, and a premium policy is sold for $2,560. The dollar value of the benefit of the standard policy is $8,740, and the dollar value of the premier policy is $26,000. And the company has 188,000 policyholders. So the 188,000 policy owners, 61.3% of them have the standard policy, and the rest have the premium policy. Historical data indicates that 18.3% of standard policyholders die within a year of purchasing their policies, and 8.27% of premier policyholders die within a year of purchasing their policies. To do this problem, we're going to download this. I've opened it up right here. We're going to click the cell that is left of the column title, A, and above the row title, 1, to copy and paste the template to the Excel file that you are building for lesson 5. So I'm going to click right here. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to put it in lesson 3 of the file that I saved as lesson_unit 5 snar. And I'll click that point right there, and then I'll do a Control V. Now we got to enter the information into it. The cost of the standard policy, $1,430. The cost of the premium policy, $2,560. The benefit from the standard policy is $8,740. The benefit from the premier policy is $26,000. Now, your numbers might be different than mine. The percent of standard policyholders is 61.3%. And the total, of course, is 100%. What percent of premium customers do they have? They have 38.7. These two add up to 100, right? And then they have a total of 188,000 policyholders. So they have a total of, multiply those two together, they have a total of 115,244 standard policyholders. And they have, multiplying these two together, 72,756 policyholders. The probability of death for standard policyholders is 18.3%, and 8.27% of premier policyholders die within a year. So the expected number of people who die holding the standard policy is the product of those two. Multiply those two together, and the expected number of people dying with the premier policy within the year, 6,016.9 policyholders. Now we're going to fill out this frequency table. The number of standard policyholders who die within a year is that. The number who do the same thing in the premium, among the premium policyholders, is that. The number who continue to live is that number minus that number. The number of premium policyholders that continue to live is that number minus the expected number who pass away within the year. And then this total is the sum of these two. And this total is the sum of those two. If I add these two up, I get the 188,000 policyholders total. If I add these two up, I get the 115,244 standard policyholders. If I add these two up, I get the 72,756 policyholders. Now we're going to calculate the joint probability table. The joint probability table is the number of policyholders that have the standard policy and die, divided by the number of policyholders. The probability of a policyholder dying and being a premium policyholder is that number divided by the overall total. The probability that a policyholder lives and is a standard policyholder is that divided by the overall total. And then finally, the probability that a policyholder lives and is a premium policyholder is that number divided by the overall total. The marginal probability is the sum of these two. Same thing with the marginal probability of living. The marginal probability of being a standard policyholder is the sum of these two in this column. And we do the same thing in column P, the premium column, and we get that. Now, these two add up to 1. These two add up to 1. And these two add up to 1, right? This is what's called a joint probability table. So this is just, you could sum any three of these, any one of the three, and you get 1, right? Now we're going to calculate the conditional probability table. We're conditioning on D. So given that the person has died, what is the probability that the person was a standard policyholder? Well, you can take this and divide by that, or you can take this frequency here and divide by that frequency, right? We'll take this joint probability and divide by this marginal probability. And then we'll do the same thing. So given that the people die, what's the probability that they're premier? Now, these two things add up to 1, right? Remember that from when we were doing pivot tables? Those two things add up to 1. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy that right there, right? And then I'm going to copy these two down here. So this is given that a random person lives, what's the probability they were a standard policyholder? 58.52%. Given the person lives, what's the probability that this person is a premium policyholder? 41.48%, right? Now we're going to do the conditional probabilities, conditional on being a standard policyholder and conditional on being a premium policyholder. So this time we're going to take the probability of death, dying, and standard policyholder. We're going to divide that by the probability of standard policyholder. Given the person is a standard policyholder, what's the probability that they live? And then we sum these two up. I'm going to copy this here and paste it down here because both these are going to add up to 1. I'm going to copy these over here. So these are given that the person is a premium policyholder. This is the probability of death, and this is the probability of living. These are given that the person is a standard policyholder. This is the probability of death, and this is the probability of living. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 probability distributions out of this one pivot table. Now, what is the probability that a random policyholder has a standard policy? So we're talking about a random policyholder. Another way to calculate this right here is to take the number of people who are standard policyholders and divide that by the number of policyholders. Another way to calculate this is to take the number of premium policyholders and divide it by the total number of policyholders. Using this way to calculate the marginal probabilities instead of the sums gives you a more intuitive feeling for this probability, right? So that's the probability of being a standard policyholder. Now, what is the probability that a random policyholder has the premier policy? So this right here is this is the number of people who have a premier policy, and this is the number of people who are policyholders, right? So that would be this number here. In part 3, we want to know what the probability is of the policyholder dying within a year, given that policyholder has the standard policy. These are the conditional probabilities, conditional on having the standard policy. And this is the probability of dying within a year. So this would be 0.1830. Given a random policyholder has the standard policy, what is the probability that the policyholder lives? This value here, right? The complement of that. Given a random policyholder has the premium policy. So now we're in this column here, right? Given a random policyholder has the premier policy, what is the probability that the policyholder dies within a year of purchase? These are the conditional probabilities given the policyholder has a premium policy. This is the probability that that person dies within the year. Given the random policyholder has the premier policy, what is the probability that policyholder lives? Using Bayes' rule, compute the probability of a random policyholder has a standard policy given the person dies. Okay, so the first thing we need is the probability of being a standard policyholder is this marginal probability here. We're going to multiply that by what? We're going to multiply that by the probability of death given a standard policyholder. These are the conditional probabilities of being a standard policyholder, and this is the probability of death. So that's the numerator there. And that should look familiar, 0.1122. It's the probability of death and standard policyholder. Now notice that these two numbers are the same. So I'm going to just come up here and type that because it's the same number, right? I need to calculate this part here. The probability the person is a premier policyholder. The marginal probability of that is right here. 38.7% of policyholders are premium policyholders. That's that number there, right? Now we got to multiply that by what? We're going to multiply that by the probability of death given a premier policyholder. So given the person is a premier policyholder, what's the probability of death? That number right there. Now that should look familiar, 0.0320. It's this number here. Okay, so now we got to take this number, this probability, and divide it by that sum. So we're going to do this value divided by the sum of this and that. And we get 0.7780. Well, that should look familiar. That's this number, right? 0.7780. So now we're going to calculate this probability. So now we need the probability of premier, times what? The probability of death given premier. So given premier, what's the probability of death? That. So this number and that number are the same thing. Why? Look at the formula. This number and that number are the same thing. So this is that, right? These two are the same. So I'm going to type equals, and then just come up here. We need the probability of a standard policyholder. That's in the joint probability table, 0.6130. We're going to multiply that by the probability of death given standard policyholder. So given the person is a standard policyholder, what's the probability of death? That number. Now notice this number and that number are the same thing, right? Because this right here is the same as that. Now we're going to take this and divide it by the sum of that, comma, and that. And notice when we sum these two together, we get 1. So this shows up where? Where do these two things show up? They both show up here. So this is 0.2220. Now, what is the expected income loss on the standard policy sold? Okay, the income generated from the standard policy is the price it charges per customer. It has a total of 115,244 customers. So that's the income from the standard policy. I got the premium that is charged to each premium policyholder. We're going to multiply that by the number of premium policyholders. So this is the income that is generated from the premium policies And this is the income from the standard policies. Now, what is the cost? We expect roughly 21,000 standard policyholders to die within the year. And we're going to multiply that by the benefit. We're going to multiply the death benefit for the premium policyholder. We're going to multiply that by the expected number of premium policyholders that are expected to die within the year. And we want the expected income on the standard policy sold, the expected income on the premier policy sold. The expected income or loss is the difference between those two. And then for premium customers, it's the difference in those two. So the company, to 0 decimal places, the company's losing $19 million roughly, 19.5 on the standard policies. We don't need a dollar sign, and we don't want to use commas, but making almost 30 million on the premium policies. And then what is the company's expected loss or income? Well, we're going to add these two together and we get $10 million roughly. So what's going on here is the premium policyholders, very few of them die. A lot more of the standard policyholders die than the premium or premier policyholders. But they're charging such a high premium for the premier policies that the premium policies are really profitable. And in a sense, to kind of subsidize the standard policies that lose the company money.